To all the panel members, some really rich material to think about. I'd like to open it up to questions now. If anybody has a question, please raise your hand. We have mics on both sides of the room. Do I see a hand up there in the middle? A lady in the middle there. Could we get a mic coming across now? Thanks very much.
Hello, my name is Elena Gregorio from Gregorian Terrace. When we're referring to growth, are we only referring to economic growth?
Who'd like to have a go at that? You've all got your heads down.
Well,
yes.
Yeah, to speak with candour, yes, I think that's the case. I don't think it necessarily should be the case, but certainly in the commercial world, in the private sector, it is about economic growth in the traditional sense, and we haven't yet moved beyond that, I don't think.
Anybody else want to comment?
I think that we are beginning to see some moving from that mantra of, X% GDP at the forsaking of all other things. And I think that the language of sustainable growth is getting quite a lot of currency, which is the understanding that growth as we might traditionally value it actually won't work going forward, because if we just pursue GDP growth at the expense of environment and social issues, then there will be no growth at all.
Yes.
So I think that there's an increasing recognition of limits to growth as we might economic growth, and actually an increasing awareness that economic well-being is really completely linked to how you're stewarding environmental assets and your social assets. But I think, as Paul knows, that kind of hypothesis in the city doesn't really go down that well at the moment. But interestingly, though, actually outside of the city, if you talk to boards of many leading organisations, they really do understand that, and they're talking about sustainable growth.
Maybe short-term versus long-term. 3 months is one thing, but
and it's
20 years.
actually the absence of leadership that Paul talks about in the city that's slowing down their efforts to move from kind of one-dimensional economic growth through to sustainable growth.
Very good. Thank you. Said, yes.
I'll just say it is very much that sort of very linear thinking, which is very, very one-dimensional. And the more you use that sort of thinking, because you're under pressure from shareholders and the markets to deliver that sort of growth, then you're going to be more or less constantly reusing the same processes to come up with linear models of economic growth in that sense, rather than a more complex model looking at many different factors.
Paul, you agree with that? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other point, again, relevant to what Asmat was showing earlier, I think one of the impediments for thinking about growth beyond the simple economic sense is that, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but a lot of people would argue that humans are hardwired to want more stuff. It's really hard not to want more stuff. So if there's an economic system that promises you more stuff, then you're sort of going to go for that. And then that's what has to be overcome if one's going to define growth beyond more stuff.
So if it's a hardwiring...
Are we hardwired to get more stuff?
Yeah.
I think it's part of I mentioned that in the sort of rear left, we have all these frameworks of the world that we've built. And we've built a world where we actually consider it's important to have more stuff for security. Actually, if you think about it, that's not true. And so it's a question of reframing the models that we've built. Economists actually are very strong in the right rear quadrant, and the moral philosophers strong in the right frontal quadrant. So we need a balance of many perspectives to start changing those models. So actually, I think hardwired is probably too strong.
Thank you. We have a question from the back there. And then the lady over in the rear there afterwards.
Anna Simpson, Green Futures magazine. There's a very good question on our table here. Who is for each speaker, who is your most admired leader and why?
Wow. Who would like to answer that? I was asked that question. I was running a leadership session, by the way, in the Middle East about 3 or 4 months ago. And I asked that question of the panel at the end. And the first panel member said, it's obvious, Mohammed. And the second one said Mohammed. And in fact, everybody said Mohammed was the greatest leader in the Middle East. So it was a very easy question to answer. But I think it might be more complex here.
Well, I'll go.
Thank you,
I mean,
Asmat.
I would say Nelson Mandela, actually. Obviously not for any reasons of economic stability and sustainability, but the fact that he did bring about such a huge change in a mindset of a nation without lots of bloodshed, which is normally the case, shows that a huge change can take place if people, and I think it's the quiet leadership in a sense. So there was a certain persistence, quiet leadership that came through, and that led to enormous change.
Okay, we have Nelson Mandela. Who else is a candidate?
So
Sally.
I'm going to cheat outrageously because I don't want to offend any of our partners at Forum for the Future. So I'm going to have two. Clearly, I'd have these two, but they're here already. So I would say, for the reason I picked both of these because they're trying to challenge the status quo, and they're trying to, in particular, wake the city up. And that's both Paul Polman and Ian Cheshire,
yes,
who've said, "Come on, we can do this, but you're not helping us." And so for that reason, I really want them to succeed because I think that's the route to changing some of the economic system that's currently holding back progress towards sustainability.
Right. Nick, have you got a...
I can't come up with a single name in the sense that I think that there have been a lot of leaders that have showed extreme leadership in very difficult circumstances. I think it's great if people come up with ideas, if people come up with new things, if people can realize their own ambitions. And so there's a leader in anyone.
Well, I think it was such an impressive part of what you were saying when you were talking about Ecover's experience, that you instead of saying, there was a plan and it was imposed, all the way through you were talking about people coming on board, the customers, the employees, the stakeholders, and this sort of dynamism developing where the leadership was through the organization.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think you have to involve everybody. Of course, at some point you need to take decisions and you need to direct into go into a certain direction perhaps, but I think the strength of an organization is that entire organization. I think that's what makes it strong or weak.
Paul, do you have a
Well, there was a couple in this context, and the first observation does underline the point Sally was making about it being a limited constituency, because I was sat here thinking Pullman and Cheshire, exactly the two you came up with, which is rather sad that I ended up with the same two people, but I do admire enormously the leadership they're showing, and also the personal risks that they've taken. They've had to be quite courageous in going out on a limb in the way that they have. But the other one in this area would be Brundtland, I think, with the work that's done in the mid-90s, setting up a lot of the vision of sustainable growth.
Good. Well, we'll revisit that. There was a lady at the back. Yes, thank you. Question there.
Hello.
Yes?
Hi. Kate Bull, the People's Supermarket. From what I've heard from the four speakers, are they suggesting that actually large corporations should actually look towards the cooperative business model, because obviously that has a greater engagement that actually brings on more talent within the organisation? And if that's the case, how do we get the city to actually recognise that the cooperative model, whether that be an IPS or a BENCOM, could actually help them move forward and is something that they should invest in?
Thank you. Is that one for you, Paul, to think about? How would the city respond to cooperative model?
I think most people would, where the cooperative model does work well, so certainly it's recognised, but the view that's generally held, and this may well be wrong, is that it has limited applicability to the broad economy, so it's part of the answer, but not the whole answer. In terms of the ability of the city to engage with models aside from the classic joint stock company, it is very limited. There really isn't a lot in that regard. I personally think that part of the answer in terms of the financial system has to be a portion of the financial system which is not private sector. Years ago I did some work as a student for the Trustee Savings Bank before it was bought by Lloyds, and TSB, to my mind, is a classic example of a financial institution which was set up largely to bring financial services to the working classes, the poor working classes, that they would have been considered then. And I think it had an admirable role. It got destroyed because it got swept up into the sort of private sector banking system with the acquisition by Lloyds. So I'm not sure the private sector will deliver it, but I think part of the solution to the financial services puzzle has to be actually a cooperative approach within financial services to target specific groups that wouldn't necessarily be picked up by the more profit maximizing banks and other types of financial firms.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question here on Twitter. Let me just read this for the panel. Question for the panel. Aviva and Paul have shown leadership in reporting. Is reporting a key driver for leaders of the 21st century?
Obviously, I'm happy to have
Yeah, well, or anybody else?
Does anyone else want to go?
No, please, keep going, Paul.
Yeah, shall I?
You're
Okay.
on a roll.
I think it is critically important because as an investor, our portfolio managers want to make long-term investments. For obvious reasons, that's aligned with sustainable economic growth. To make long-term investments, they need data and information on long-term strategies that companies have, and that has to include environmental, social and governance factors, as well as the more regular information which one would seek. So if companies are not reporting that information, then investors can't take that into account when they're looking at the prospects for that company. If it is taken into account, whether it's from commercial opportunities that it brings or identifying the risks that a company has because it's not strong in terms of mitigating ESG type factors, then that ought to begin to move capital flows towards companies that are set up sustainably and away from ones which aren't. So clearly that is important. Having said that, I would recognise that providing that reporting is only half of the answer. It will only work if the asset owners and their asset managers that are employed by them also engage with that data and use it. Because clearly if all the reporting is done and it goes straight in the virtual waste paper bin, then obviously it won't achieve the desired effect.
Thank you. Thank you. Any question? I don't see a hand up anywhere. Anybody got a question for the panel? Yes, Jim. We get the mic forward here to Jim.
Thank you. I'm just wondering to what extent, particularly our two leaders on the panel, think that bravery and a sort of necessary acceptance of criticism is part of leadership, and because both of you two are held up as enlightened leaders in this context, but one only has to look at your Wikipedia page for Ecover to see there's been quite a lot of challenges, particularly from the environmental side, who've been challenging your environmental credentials. And Paul, certainly when you closed down your SRI team last year, a lot of people questioned whether you really were as committed as sometimes you appear. And I'm just wondering if that's a necessary part of leadership.
Mick, do you want to have
I think it's a part of leadership, yes, in the sense that you can't do good for everyone. There will also always be people that have a specific interest or a specific approach, and that will expect from you to do this or that. I think in the end you have to come up with a set of principles, a set of decisions, a set of criteria, and you have to stand for that and defend that. I think you can't do good for everyone, and we have experienced that in the past, and we will continue to experience that probably also in the future. Certainly on environmental standards, we had, for instance, quite strong discussions also with the European Ecolabel about criteria for products. We feel that our criteria are more strict than the criteria for the European Ecolabel, but it also means that at some points we have missed opportunities, we have missed business because we kept that attitude. On the other hand, I think it's part of the authenticity and the integrity of our company to actually say, yeah, that's what we stand for, and we stick to that.
Paul?
From my view, but I may have led a charmed existence, and it may not be typical, but I've been pleasantly surprised by how rational and reasonable people have been in terms of reacting to pronouncements I've made or Aviva have made. So, years ago I used to work in this area with ABN AMRO, but I was sort of below the radar. But since deciding to be more public in expressing views like this, I had expected all manner of problems, because clearly, particularly in ethics, you can't please 10% of the people you know you're doing well. So I was expecting a rough ride, but to be quite honest, it hasn't happened. I think the responses that I've experienced have been entirely reasonable and reasoned, and therefore not particularly painful. Now, I may have been fortunate, maybe other leaders have a much tougher time, but I've been pleasantly surprised by how little difficulty it has caused when I express views.
Good. Any more questions? From the two at the back there, and the gentleman in the corner first, perhaps. Thank you. Then the middle table.
Thanks. Jamal Moore, Carbon Clear. The tenure of leaders in large corporations has been decreasing year on year, 10 years, 8 years, 6 years. How do you put in place and embed a sustainability initiative and ensure that it's not going to be turned over or lose focus after the current leader, the current inspirational leader, leaves the company?
Sally, I see you nodding.
Because I recognise that description. And I think the answer is very easy. It has to be sustainability. It has to be integrated into the business. So where you see a change in focus on sustainability that's linked with the departure of a visionary CEO, that's often because it was a personal passion, and the new practice, new policy, new approach never made its way into the heart of the business model. And so what we really advocate at Forum is actually you need to take sustainability from something over here and stick it into the business strategy, because then it becomes part of people's jobs, it becomes part of procedure, and even if there is a change at the top, the worst that can happen is that some things might slow down, but it's very, very hard to undo the business model and undo the business strategy.
That would be true for you, Mick, as well. It's embedded in your organisation now, right?
I totally agree.
If you fell under a bus tomorrow, would it carry on?
Absolutely, and the bus also probably.
There we go. Fine, we have a question there from the middle, the back.
Hi, Kelsey Lynn from Fire Lake Capital. I think one of the biggest challenges for sustainability is often the conflict between the longer-term benefits of sustainability pressured against the short-term demands of a private company CEO. So particularly for those of you in the private sector, I'd be curious how you alleviated the demands of your shareholders and other stakeholders asking for short-term results, and what recommendations you have for other leaders that experience those challenges.
Asmat, why don't we start with you, because you've got this wonderful theoretical model, and I'm sure one or two of the people will think, well, how's that going to help my short-term results, or how, how will I implement?
Well, the way I was hearing the question was what the leaders have actually done in order to sort of placate, in a way, the demands from, am I right in this? Placate the demands of the people who are wanting the quick wins.
Yes, exactly.
And so I'm not sure that I've got a particularly good answer as to what they've done to placate their I think my answer would be you have to really persuade them as to the benefits to them for a long-term strategy. And unless you can convincingly show that there are benefits, anyone who's there for the short term is not going to be satisfied unless they really do see the benefits. So
okay. Well, Paul, you see the short-term point of view all the time. How do you deal with it?
Well, I think it's interesting. The last two questions are both related to that time horizon, and clearly, I think it's clear there is a real problem in the economic system being so short-term oriented. Whether it's an outgrowth of broader societal trends that were short-term when we're watching TV, I mean, it could be it's not the economy that's the cause of it. Nevertheless, I think if we're going to get sustainable economic growth, we do need the financial system and the economic system to be more long-term in focus. To a degree, the way you respond to that as a leader is to make that point. I think it's frankly crazy that companies are required to do very detailed quarterly reporting. Yeah. I see it as an insider, the amount of rehearsal and practice that goes into standing up and making a half-hour update on that, and it just doesn't make any sense. So, when corporate leaders in the private sector suggest not even producing quarterly results, that's something that I would welcome and support.
Yeah, and several have managed to persuade the city they don't need them. I mean, Mick, you've taken the long-term view as well.
I think it's important that you have to make sure that the long-term outlook is nicer than the short-term, and that you keep all your stakeholders involved and challenged by the long-term. It's important, but of course it requires a different approach of some like financial incentives and so on. It requires a different approach of that.
Sure. We have a question at the back there, Sue.
Hello, Pankaj from Cranfield School of Management. I have a simple one and probably a silly one. Do we have to use sustainability, CSR as keywords when we are doing all what we are doing? Because most of the times what I have seen, there is a lot of skepticism involved, and you end up actually fighting, although you might end up becoming either a martyr or a hero. But what would be a world where you don't have to say this, but you can do whatever you like?
Lovely question. Mick, you're laughing.
Just call it smart business.
Yeah.
Business.
Smart business.
Smart business, yeah. It should be the new business as usual, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you read some more recent sustainability reports that are emerging that actually are integrated in the annual report and accounts, which is the best place for that data to be, you often don't even see the word sustainability, because actually it's about doing good business, it's about doing smart business. And as you start to roll out a sustainability program, we always advise our business partners to ditch the language so oftentimes, because it is confusing, it's complex, and you need to find a language which works for you internally. So it is an issue, but actually...
You see in a short space of time, it will be the business, a bit like people talked about their digital business, and now it's the business.
Yeah, and to just give you an example of how that's changing, a few years ago, we would often help organisations develop sustainability strategies that then would get integrated into the business strategy. We now have debates about this is just one strategy that is actually about being a sustainable business. And so it's very much what Said was saying about people are looking kind of further, deeper, wider to what they would characterise as success within a business. And that allows you to bring in this, this deeper understanding. So actually, my prediction is that 5-10 years from now, we won't be using the language of CR or sustainability as confined to environmental topics. It will be about a sustainable business.
Is the issue a bit that in terms of the question that this is often regarded as a program, or rather than the business or the program?
So it can often be regarded as something that someone else is doing over there that's nothing to do with me, thank you very much. And also, the language is often offered up as an excuse to do nothing. Oh, it's too complicated, I don't understand it. And so I've seen that happen a lot. And so it's really important to cut through the language as soon as you can internally.
Okay, anybody else? Another question from the floor? Just here, yes, table 3.
Hi, it's Mark Chadwick from Carbon Clear. Paul, I think you mentioned that government seem less willing to step up to the leadership plate in terms of sustainability, and I think I feel that sounds right. So the era of government leadership seems to be on the wane. Certainly unilateral government leadership seems to be slipping. So therefore it falls to government to step in, to corporates to step in and do something. But then Sally, you mentioned that you could count fewer than 10 corporate leaders. So are we in a situation here where we've got a leadership vacuum? Perhaps that's what we're working out today. And if so, what tools or techniques do you guys have up here to try and inspire corporate leaders to be braver, to put their heads above the parapet, and to try and be the driver of change?
Yes, Asma.
Putting on the previous hat, I was in the pharmaceutical industry for 25 years, and a lot of that time was spent in Germany. A lot of the change that I saw to do with our packaging and initiatives for the environment came from the workforce themselves. There was a very, very strong wish within the organisation that the credentials of the organisation were improved, and the leaders responded to that feeling in the organisation. They're always in this very difficult place of having to keep the shareholders and the investors happy on nice forecasts for the city. But they can't ignore what was a real growing groundswell of opinion within organisations. So I think if you spread the message and people understand the message in the organisation, that helps leaders to actually bring about change.
Yes, Mick, you're nodding.
Well, I think there is a risk that we fall into the public expects business to change, business expects politicians to change, and we all expect somebody to change something, and nothing is happening, of course. I think, indeed, you need to have examples, you need to have examples that can be followed, but it needs to be the whole of our society that needs to be involved, otherwise I wouldn't be optimistic about it.
Well, Sally, you must see this with your clients. I mean, where does the vicious circle start, and is there a leadership vacuum to the question?
I think post-Rio 20 plus, it's really clear that leadership from government is not going to be forthcoming. And so there is a lot of expectation on the business community. But I agree with Mick that the business community on its own won't be able to provide the solutions that we need to see. They actually need to mobilise civil society more effectively. And whilst, yes, you can count the number of visionary CEOs maybe on two hands if you're feeling particularly creative, but what they're doing is really, really important, because they're showing actually by being sustainable they are being successful, and they're creating change in their own right because other businesses will follow them. But what both Paul Polman and Ian Cheshire are trying to do is to mobilise the mainstream consumer, to mobilise the mainstream, because until we mobilise mainstream people on this agenda, then we're only going to stutter towards some of the solutions that we need to see. So the reality is that we need effort by both government to provide the enabling environment, by business to show the art of the possible, and by wider civil society, mainstream people to show, yeah, this works for us. And it goes back to a really early point, which is actually people do want more stuff. You know, we are kind of wired a little bit to sort of want that, but actually there's an increasing recognition that more stuff doesn't make us happy, and that penny's dropping really loudly right now. And so I think right now we have a moment where broader society is saying, hang on a minute, I might have all this stuff, but am I happy? Probably not. So there's a kind of, you know, an alignment of different factors, which I think mean that if business does show more leadership, takes its consumers with them, then we might see a step change in how we see this agenda progressing.
Question there, gentlemen, in the green shirt.
Thank you. Andrew Bannister from the Volkswagen Group. I think we're using the word we in a particular sense here to mean we in the UK, or we in Western Europe, or we in the EU. And it might be true that for us, or for some of us, the penny is dropping that more stuff doesn't make us happy. But that means very little compared with the 2 billion people in the world for whom the penny is still way up in the air, and more stuff is exactly what they're going for. How can we, whoever the we is, provide leadership for those people so that those 2 billion people don't recapitulate the unintended consequences of what we did over the last 100 years?
I think
Sally.
that's a really, really interesting question. And of course, you know, that's the immediate pushback that you get in these conversations, you know, quite rightly so, in that it's all very well for us to say that it doesn't make us happy, but there are billions of people that want what we have. So if you look at the stratification of 7.5 billion people predicted on the Earth by 2020, the 1 billion at the top is us in this room, in the Western economies and developed economies. There's another 6.5, one of which is nearly getting to where we are in terms of quality of life, but the rest, 2 billion at the bottom, are rural poor. They've had absolutely nothing. And I think that, yes, they do want what we have. They want the American dream. But I think the reality is it's not going to be possible to generate the stuff to market in the way that we have done in the past, because we're running out of resources. And actually, there's an increasing recognition that we need to bring goods and services to market differently. And so I think part of the solution here is that the companies that will succeed going forward will be those that actually are lifting people out of poverty but have a wider social role to play and provide a social value. Because I think that whilst people, yes, do, you know, they want to be lifted out of poverty, they also want to be, you know, feel good about that. So if you think about the growth plans of companies like Unilever, it's all about growth at the bottom of the pyramid for the billions that don't have anything. But it's about providing a social service, a social purpose. So I think the way in which we're framing growth will change, because we were given what we wanted and so on and so forth by using a huge amount of carbon. That's just not going to be possible going forward. So we'll see a different kind of growth and a different sort of business with, I think, social purpose at its heart.
Thanks. Paul, did you have a thought there?
Yeah, it was just in terms of specific of the question of what we should be doing. I think the answer is absolutely nothing, because that portion of the world are extremely suspicious of the motives of people in the West trying to address this. So the best thing we can do is absolutely nothing and say, look, it's up to you guys. You can decide how you're going to develop your economies. It's not for us to tell you how to address that. We can be constructive by making technology available where we have technology which would be more sustainable in terms of their needs. I think that's something we should do. But whenever the West tries to engage with the poorer countries to come up with a solution, there's just no trust there, and it almost causes more harm than good. So we almost have to, which is difficult for us, to sit on our hands and say, well, it's not for us to tell you what to do. You're going to have to find your own way. And then that will build some trust.
We have time for one more question, and I can see two hands, so let's go quickly over here first.
I'm Helena Farsa from Carbon Leapfrog. How important is legislation, regulation, and other policy making in terms of driving the correct business behaviour?
Paul and Sally nodding here. Who'd like to have a go at that?
I think it's really important, but you need to think about where and how you use it. If you think about how change happens, typically you've got organisations or individuals displaying what we would call pioneering practice, showing the art of the possible, showing how things can be different. And no amount of legislation will make that happen, because that's about organisations, people taking risk in the way that we've been talking about. Where legislation policy really kicks in is about really mainstreaming that pioneering practice and making that pioneering practice normalised. And that's where we absolutely need legislation and policy, because if you're a leader in the business, you only want to go so far ahead of the competition. If you go too far ahead, then it's commercial suicide. So at some point you need the legislative framework to come in behind you and actually to allow everyone else to come up to where you are. So it's really important, but I don't think it sparks or prompts innovation.
Okay, thank you, Paul.
Yeah, I view it as being quite critical. The free market model that we base the capitalist system on is obviously based on an assumption of a set of rules and laws which govern the way that market works, and that has always been true and will remain true. So if you're going to deal with the economics of externality, you have to have laws to stop firms tipping their waste into the river. If they're allowed to, they will. If you're looking at the period over which people are investing portfolios, should they take environmental, social and governance issues into account? There's some real free rider issues there. If there aren't rules to prevent the free rider problem, it will happen. So I think the legislation side is absolutely critical.
Do we have one last quick question at the back there?
Claire Martinsky, Forum for the Future. I've got a question about women in leadership positions. In my role, I see a lot of women in quiet leadership positions. But I was wondering if you had thoughts on women in the sort of noisier leadership positions, shall we say, and if you had any thoughts on the quota discussions that were happening recently.
Do the men want to have a go at that? Any thoughts? Yeah?
Anita Roddick was not very quiet.
Sally?
I'm not that quiet.
No, all right.
But one of my interesting experience I had with engaging with people at Aviva in terms of what we needed to do to get more women into senior positions, because they were dropping out in the sort of middle ranking area. And we had a session sort of analysing that and working out what it was about women that caused this to happen, and went through all of the psychoanalysis and so forth. What was interesting, a number of the men in the room put their hands up and said, I'm a woman, what you're describing, that's me. And the point it made is that there's a set of characteristics which we predominantly associate with men, and a set of characteristics which we predominantly associate with women, but it's not black and white. There are lots of men, if you like, that actually have more of what we'd call the female characteristics.
Your research would base that on as well.
In that sense, I don't think quotas is the way to go. It's really a question of making sure that the way you run a company is not inadvertently setting up obstacles to certain types of traits, which you will typically find among women, but you will also have male executives who will be put off and underutilised because of it. So it needs to be richer than a simple gender discussion.
Yes, I would agree that what is classified as male and what is classified as female it seems to be more of a characteristic of culture and the culture that you're in rather than anything fundamental. And certainly there's been some research which says that the gender differences are culturally seen more in sort of equatorial zones, and as you go further to the north or the south, if you go to Norway, Sweden, the gender differences are not so wide. So I think it really isn't something which is quite as hardwired as we think it is.
Excellent. Well, that's a great question to close the pack. Can we just thank the panel for their terrific... And that, Jim Woods will summarise the session.